All right, and we will start, let's say now. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our second Lunch and Learn of Donor Experience Week. My name is Samantha Lego. I'm Keela's Marketing Director. You may or may not know me by now. We have Ines in the background fielding all of your technical questions, so feel free to say hi. Before jumping into things, I just want to start by acknowledging that here in Vancouver, we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I'd like to give thanks for their generosity and hospitality on these lands and waters. We're super excited to have you all participating in Keela's 5-day virtual conference. If you attended our session so far, welcome back. And if you're just tuning in now, welcome and thanks for joining us. Before we begin this 45-minute session, I wanted to say a quick thank you not only to our speakers who have donated their time this week, but also to our sponsors, Imagine Canada, Pano, and the Good Partnership. Without everybody involved in Donor Experience Week, we wouldn't be able to put on these types of free educational events. I also want to thank all of you as well. This is Keela's biggest digital conference so far, and Ines, Mel, and I have learned a lot from everybody's comments and feedback, so please keep it coming. We're very, very, very appreciative. And while we can't meet you face-to-face right now, we can still network digitally. That's why I recommend jumping into our community forum. You can treat it as the lunch and learn between sessions. Our goal is to help you connect with like-minded peers and continue the conversation even after this session ends. So far, I'm the only one who's posted in there, and I'm feeling pretty lonely, but you know, I work from home, so I'm used to a party of one. I still wouldn't mind some friends though, so pop on into the community forum with the link that Ines just put in the chat. And so with that, I am excited to introduce our speaker for today's Lunch and Learn. Jude Scheimer manages Salesforce at the Center for Popular Democracy and CPD Action. They believe in technology as a tool for progressive change. Jude is trans, non-binary, and previously presented on gender-inclusive data at Keela's Plugged In conference in the spring of 2020. I see some of you attended that session, and we're excited to welcome you back today to build on that conversation. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation in the Q&A box or the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. We really want to make this as interactive as possible and hope that we can get a good conversation going. Don't worry, you will receive the recording along with the slide deck at the end of the conference. I'd also like to mention that by attending this webinar, you are eligible to receive 1 CFRE credit. If you check the chat, there will be a link there with Donor Experience Week CFRE tracking sheet. You can download a copy yourself and keep track of which accredited sessions you've attended. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out at melissa.bilko, B-I-L-K-O, @keela.com for CFRE credits. So with that out of the way, I'd like to give a very warm welcome back to Jude.
Hello, thanks so much, Samantha. This is great. I'm really excited to be back. Again, my name is Jude. I'm going to share my screen. We'll get that started. Oh, Sam or Ines, I think that you need to enable screen sharing for me. Aha, yes. Thank you very much. All right, so you should in a moment see respect your donors with gender inclusive data, big blue screen. If anyone is not seeing that, pop that into the chat and Sam or Ines will see that. Great. Hi, my name is Jude Scheimer. My pronouns are they, them, as Sam mentioned, and also it's in my Zoom name. I'm CRM manager at the Center for Popular Democracy. That's a progressive movement organization based in New York City, where I live, and also Washington, DC. We organize to elect progressive US political candidates and push forward legislation like universal health care and immigration reform, and also engage in protest, which is really great. So I work mostly in Salesforce, making sure data on human beings and their donations is clean and useful and used respectfully. And before that, I worked with hundreds of performing arts nonprofits for a ticketing system, and I helped with, among other things, their online forms and managing their donor data. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And let's dive right in. So here's a donation form, very like one I saw on an organization's website a while back. These are all fake forms, by the way, so I'm not calling anybody out. So you might already be able to see what's wrong. I was trying to donate, but the salutation field was required, and there was no gender neutral option, except for doctor, which I'm not. The generally accepted gender neutral salutation is MX, pronounced mix, but they didn't have that one, and I would have loved to not have to select a salutation at all because I don't typically use one. So I contacted the org to ask if they could make that field unrequired, and they said they couldn't. so I didn't donate, and that was it. I am transgender non-binary, so I don't identify as female. I don't quite identify as male. I use they, them pronouns. I don't use a salutation at all. So things like getting called ma'am by a server or having only male and female options on a form, that's annoying, but they're not the end of the world for me personally. A little more concerning is when I'm asked to leave my gym locker room, for example, or chased out of a bathroom by a bathroom attendant, which has happened more than once. Or subject to experiences with OBGYNs that I'm not going to get into here. It was also more than annoying when I'd just spoken at a conference and an attendee approached me to tell me how inconvenient my pronouns were to her personally. So some things are more distressing, some things are less, but as a whole, it just gets kind of exhausting, and I really appreciate when orgs make a minimal effort to acknowledge my existence. That's nice. Okay, so what do I mean when I say gender data or gender inclusive data? So gender, this term can be applied to several different kinds of data, some of which is not literally gender data. So we have actual gender identity, which can include female, male, man, woman, non-binary, genderqueer, trans woman, cis man, etc. Lots of different terminology that people may use to identify themselves. Then we have pronouns, which are not identical to gender. So for example, a trans man might prefer to use they, them pronouns. A cis woman, cisgender meaning not trans, so someone who was assigned a gender at birth and does still identify with that gender. A cis woman may also prefer to use they, them pronouns. But the English language and many other languages gender their pronouns. So pronouns may be considered gender data as well. We have salutations like Ms. and Mr. or Mix, which again are associated with gender, although not the same thing. And then we have natal sex, female, male, or intersex, which is absolutely not gender, but is so often conflated with gender, J.K. Rowling. Natal sex is basically never something a nonprofit needs to know about their donors, but this is often a point of confusion. So for anyone who could use a primer on sex versus gender, someone can have, for example, male chromosomes and be a woman because she's trans. An intersex person can have quote unquote male chromosomes, but produce female hormones and have been assigned female at birth and still identify as a woman. So sex and gender are aligned for the majority of people, but they are not always aligned, which means that they're not the same thing. This is really not even a debate to be had. Some of these types of data may have nothing to do with your organization, which means you don't have to worry about them. If you take nothing else away from this presentation, I recommend that you just take salutation off your donation forms entirely. In general, on a donation form, you want the bare minimum fields that will allow that person to donate. So name, contact info, credit card info, done. The more fields on your form and the more required fields, the lower conversion you'll tend to see. It's not a hard and fast rule, but when in doubt, the fewer fields, the better. It's not cool, by the way, though, if you refrain from asking for salutation on your forms, but still fill it in later in your database, either by guessing or using a program that tries to guess based on name, by swapping data with other orgs. I once became a member of a very famous civil liberties union in the US without entering a salutation. They didn't even ask me for it, which was great. And they printed my membership card as Ms. Jude Scheimer. I don't know how they got that. I don't know where it came from, but it took me 2 phone calls to get them to remove it from my name. I called once, they said, oh yes, we see, sorry, we've taken away Ms. And then, you know, several months went by and I kept getting emails from them and addressed to Ms. Jude Scheimer, so I had to call again. It was really annoying and unnecessary. So if the idea of not asking donors for their salutation up front worries you, why is that? What is your org afraid will happen if you don't address every donor by a salutation? There's a myth in nonprofit development that respect to all donors looks like Mr. and Mrs. and Sir and Ma'am, because we assume, rightly or wrongly, depending on the org or the industry, that major donors are a certain age and that these terms of address are important to them, but that is not actually universally true at all. And also, there are two kinds of respect, right? So there's the respect of, say, a subordinate to their superiors, but then there's mutual human respect. And forcing someone into a situation where their gender is suddenly simultaneously important and then maybe also invisible is not a respectful situation. So salutations, putting that aside for a second, that might not be the only gender data under consideration. So let's talk about the gender field itself. I have seen orgs add gender to their forms when they're not actually asking for gender. Sometimes they're really asking if you want a fitted or a non-fitted t-shirt in your membership package, and those are not the same thing. So if you want to know what kind of t-shirt style people like, ask that. Do not ask for their gender. So what though if you do genuinely want to know somebody's gender? You're like, nope, it's not a t-shirt, it's gender. What if you want to know all sorts of things about your donor because you want to know your donors better? So to start with, steer clear of this example because as I mentioned earlier, you typically don't want a whole bunch of fields on your donation forms, especially you do not want a lot of required fields on your donation form. So any form that's intended to collect revenue is not a great form for collecting demographic data. You're going to get potential donors wondering, why am I being asked for all this personal information? And it's going to turn them off. A good justification for asking for gender is if you're accepting some kind of application because you want to ensure equity. So you want to make sure that you don't end up with an all male or all cisgender presenters at an event or in your new works programming. That's great. So if that's your objective, make sure your gender field has at minimum female, male, non-binary, prefer not to say, and a write-in field. And more importantly, ask for pronouns. Anytime your form is collecting information on a person you'll be interacting with in real life, it's a great idea to ask for their pronouns upfront. Another time that you might want to ask for gender is in an anonymous demographic survey. So if you're wondering what kind of audience are we reaching, does that audience align with our mission? What kind of donors are we attracting? A survey can be a good way to find that out. You can collect info like gender, race, ethnicity, age, income range. Whereas donating should be as quick and easy as possible. You have more flexibility with a survey. So if someone is a survey filling type, and I am personally, I actually love filling out surveys. Some people think that's weird. But also if you offer some kind of incentive for filling out the survey, like a raffle, you can reasonably give people 2 to 5 minutes of questions and they'll be happy to fill it out. How detailed should your gender options be if you are putting gender on a form? So there isn't a hard and fast rule. I'm afraid there isn't like a singular council who like dictates what all of the field values should be and how they should be presented. And that information changes over time as language evolves. But there are general guidelines. One guideline is that your options may be a little bit different depending on your objective. So if you're researching with an anonymous survey, it's a good idea to include a lot of different gender fields like female, male, woman, trans, genderqueer, cis, etc. And then you can let people select whatever combination they want, plus a write-in field if you didn't catch something. If you're trying to ensure gender equity on a submission form, for example, the examples that I showed earlier are usually sufficient. So female, male, non-binary, prefer not to say, and write-in. And just a quick note as a reminder, we are talking about gender here, not natal sex. There are next to no justifications for asking for a donor's natal sex, so don't do it. Great. So if you're considering a demographic survey, or if you weren't, but all of a sudden you are because of this presentation, here are some best practices about that. So one, you always want to make sure that you have an objective. What are you hoping to see? What are you worried you'll see? How are you planning to use this info to improve as an organization? And then tell your audience that objective. Be transparent about why you're gathering data, what you're going to use it for. You don't have to get into all the nitty-gritty details, but something like, we want to make sure our programming reflects our audience, so we'd love to get to know you better. That's totally acceptable and is going to convey, typically the amount of information people are looking for. Also, it's got to be anonymous. Some people are not going to feel comfortable, for example, disclosing their trans status if they're being identified. Anonymous data can still be really useful. And if you are interested in, say, seeing trends, then you can always just ask for postal code. If you want to know what demographics look like in various areas of your reach, postal code is fine. It's not personally identifiable information. If somebody just puts their, like their gender, their race, ethnicity, income, and postal code, no one who can get a hold of that database is going to be able to identify who that person is, which is good. You also want to make sure that people can select multiple options and write in their own answers, so you're covering all identities. So you don't have to worry so much about, did I get every single tiny identity? If people are able to write in an option, then you're pretty much good. And finally, I'm focusing on gender here, but there are best practices for any demographic fields you might put on a form, like race, ethnicity, and age. So do your research there as well. And then we've got pronouns. So I mentioned pronouns earlier. I showed an example of a pronoun field on a submission form. And here's an event form. This can apply also in the virtual event world too, because that's the world we live in right now. If attendees are going to be interacting or chatting with each other somehow, pronouns are really good to know. You don't need to know that person's gender, but pronouns are useful. So it's great to normalize asking for and sharing pronouns regardless of how many trans or non-binary donors or patrons you think you have, which you can never actually know. The more people who share pronouns, the easier it is for people whose pronouns might not be immediately obvious to others. So where do you put your donors' pronouns? I'm a Salesforce admin and developer, and in Salesforce, we have contacts. And while there's no pronoun field by default, this object is highly customizable. So I made a pronoun field and just stuck it on the page right below name and account name. Depending on your database, this can get as basic or as complex as you need it to be. So here's an example of a nice, robust setup. So this imaginary org has a member community set up through Salesforce. So like a forum where members can interact with each other and customize a profile. There's a pronoun field on that profile, which I built. And if they fill it out, their pronouns are visible on this internal contact page as well. And I added the pronoun field to the preview bubble that you get if you hover over a contact's name anywhere in Salesforce. So for example, if two development associates are talking to each other about this donor, they can just hover over their name and reference their pronouns really easily. And here are my pronouns on my internal Salesforce user page, because as an employee at this organization, I want my coworkers to know my pronouns as well. And you can add pronouns pretty much anywhere. Email signatures are an excellent place to add pronouns. Even if a platform doesn't have a dedicated pronoun field, like Zoom, for example, participants can put their pronouns right in their name, like I did, by the way. Zoom, y'all, get it together, make a pronoun field. Normalizing pronoun usage for everyone, not just trans people, has basically zero downsides. It makes a space inclusive, whether for your donors, your staff, event goers, anyone else your organization might be interacting with. So I'm gonna close with an anecdote that's the opposite of the one I started with, where I couldn't donate because the salutation field didn't think I existed. I was at an event a while back and someone was helping me fill out a donation form on a tablet. And they asked, would you like to enter an optional salutation? We have mix available. And it was just so nice. That kind of thoughtfulness really makes my day. It took barely any effort on that org's part. So you can do it as well. I hope you've been able to take a few things away from this presentation that you can apply at your organization. And I'm also super happy to chat more about this. So we're going to open it up for questions. And also there's my email address. Feel free to reach out. So yeah, I saw some things coming into the chat. I wasn't looking at it, but.
Thank you so much, Jude. What a valuable and easy to implement lesson for donor stewardship. Thanks for sharing your wisdom, perspective, and expertise today. We do have a couple of questions. We have some great feedback as well, just saying great ideas. Mine was, that's a great point for not asking for too many required forms on a donation form. That's best practice. Annika says, so helpful, thank you. Some of our questions that we've had come in, this one is from Sarah, just a pondering, not a question. She's wondering whether we know if there are any case studies between donation forms with outdated traditional pronouns and current best practices. I would love to see the increase in donation conversions. I don't know of any off the top of my head, but I'd love to look into it.
Neither do I, and that would be such a great study. I would love to see more information about this in general. I have been interested in a while in sort of like low-key A/B campaign sort of things. And that's the sort of thing that, like, you know, you may have the resources to do as an organization. But things like write-in pronoun fields versus pick lists with a write-in option, things like that. So especially if you sort of find different best practices as you're roaming around, it's never a bad idea to, like, try something and see how it works out. And if it's not working out as you expected, you can always try something different. But yeah, I would really love to see more in-depth research about this.
Sarah, I have a challenge for you. You should run an A/B test on your donation forms, compile some data, and come back to us, and we would love to dissect that with you. We have a question come in from Jennifer. Firstly, thanks, Jude. Question on the gender drop-down options. Is it generally acceptable to have gender neutral versus non-binary, or is non-binary widely preferred?
I wonder if that varies based on location. In my field, non-binary is typical. Gender neutral has some slightly different connotations. Gender neutral, you might, is a term you might apply to language, like this is gender neutral language, they, them is a gender neutral pronoun, whereas a person would more likely to identify as non-binary.
Excellent response, thank you. We've got another question that's coming from Laura. Thank you, Jude, for this excellent informative session. I am enlightened and will follow your advice. In addition, it's not a question, it's a comment. So I will follow your advice. In addition, your presentation was succinct with easy to read slides. Well done, Laura Edwards, CFRE. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much. I try.
I've got a question about some upkeep in a database. If someone switches their pronouns, what do you think is the best practice for updating this in our system? A phone call for some would be uncomfortable, but how would you go about this?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess my first wondering is whether they're reaching out. So if someone, a good thing to do is, like, give people the option to adjust their pronouns. So, like, in the sort of robust example I gave, they have a profile that they can update, but you may also be sending out, like, a periodic sort of advanced sign up form, for example, where you're saying, please update us on your interests and things like that. And also let us know your pronouns, encouraging people to fill them out if they haven't, or to update them if they haven't. But if someone has indicated that they want to change their pronouns, do it, change them. That is the best practice. If I'm misunderstanding the scenario, feel free to let me know.
I didn't have a rebuttal come in, so I think you have hit the nail on the head there. This question feeds into that. What should I do if I make a mistake when speaking to someone who is non-binary? So I'm assuming mistaking their pronouns. How would you navigate that situation?
Such a great question. I'm personally a huge fan of the quick correction and move on. So, you know, this is Jude, and they works at Center for Popular Democracy. And if someone corrects you, I love it if when I'm correcting someone, they just say, oh, thanks, and correct themselves. So they say, Jude, she, and I say, oh, it's they, and they say, oh, thank you, they. What I would recommend is not to get super grovelly. There's a tendency among a lot of people to feel very embarrassed and maybe guilty, and to really want to apologize and, you know, maybe take the person aside and say, I'm so sorry that I did that. And in general, I would recommend against that. I know that for me personally, and for a lot of the trans people who I've discussed, who I talk about this with, it's great for it to be as little of a deal as possible. And sometimes when people have, you know, approached me to say, I mistook your pronouns, I'm so sorry, I'm really trying, I just want to let you know, I feel sort of like I'm obligated to kind of, you know, pat them on the back and say, it's okay, don't worry about it. And I really just want to get on with my day. So a quick like thank you or a quick correction and move on is great in most cases. Again, that's not universal because you're dealing with individual human beings. So there's always a chance that someone may prefer another reaction. But I think that actually speaks to an even bigger thing, which is get comfortable with messing up sometimes and with being uncomfortable. Sometimes you're going to get it wrong. It's okay. Someone might get upset about something. It's okay. If you just have good intentions and you try and you listen, and if someone says, I'd like you to do this a different way, you say, sure, and then you do that, then that's the best that you can do. And you're fine. You're fine.
We're all human, we're all learning. And I think that's a very big takeaway to come away with this session today.
Absolutely.
Our next question is from Dana, and I actually like this idea quite a lot. Since this webinar is hosted on behalf of Keela, I'm wondering if you have any specific advice for how they can continue to develop their CRM. So Jude, perhaps you would like to look at our CRM donation forms and see what we've done in terms of accessibility and equity, and then I would love for you to make some suggestions. But if you have any off the top of your head.
Let's follow up.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you, Dana. I will get back to you on that because that is a great idea. Anonymous attendee would just like to say, says, this is so important, thank you. May I suggest a similar webinar on accessible websites for those with hearing, vision, colorblind challenges? I'd be interested in that too. We actually have a webinar on that tomorrow at the same time. It's from Alice from Vengage, and it's about designing for accessibility. And so that goes through designing forms with typography and colors that are friendly to people who are colorblind. So I encourage you to sign up for that session. It's on our Donor Experience Week schedule page.
Love it.
We have another question from Annika. I love the intention to be transparent on why you are collecting different data points. Is there a best practice around how this shows up on a form or application?
I might need some clarification about how it shows up beyond some of the examples that I gave. So, how the disclaimer shows up or how the explanation. I'm going to go ahead and assume that's the question and roll with it for a second.
Disclaimer, yes.
Yes, so as close to the fields as possible. So if you want to tell people why you're asking for gender, put that right above the gender field. If you're doing an anonymous survey and you are asking for a bunch of different information, your general disclaimer right at the top about why you're asking people to fill out the survey to begin with. And then if you want to add some additional information about specific fields, then you can do that above the field as well. And typically, like a sentence or two is going to be sufficient. Doesn't necessarily have to be a whole paragraph.
Thanks. This question's from Tanya. Is there a set of gender neutral pronouns to use in letters, etc.?
So the most common gender neutral pronouns are they, them, theirs. And so if you don't know the pronoun of the person you're addressing, that's a fine place to start. Although I'll also say that if you have any ability to ask the person what their pronoun is, that's great as well. But I've noticed that increasingly a lot of online services, when they're talking about like a user in the third person, use they, them, which is a great default.
Excellent. And then I guess this feeds into the next question too from Angela. Is it bad practice to address everyone as they? I'm assuming until you know their pronouns.
It is a best practice to ask people for their pronouns. If it's a situation where you have any control over like an event and you have any ability to offer badges or virtual badges or to do a round of pronouns at the beginning of an event, anything like that, that is the most recommended so that you don't find yourself in the situation of having to assume what someone's pronouns are. Other than that, there are kind of two camps. So you will definitely talk to some people who advocate for referring to everyone as they if you don't know their pronouns. I happen to think that it's fine to make sort of an educated guess on someone's pronouns with the openness of understanding that you may be corrected. So if you're talking about a person who is a public figure, who speaks at a lot of conferences and has not disclosed to your awareness like a trans identity or using a certain pronoun, they don't put their pronouns everywhere, then you can probably go ahead and assume that person's pronouns based on their profile. But yeah, it's important to just always be mindful that you might get it wrong. So again, like, be mindful, keep an ear out, listen to people. If you can ask what the person's pronouns are, ask what their pronouns are.
And learn. We've got one question from Dave Clark. Jude, thank you for your time. Is there a specific resource you can recommend to share with our teams to better understand gender pronouns? Oh,
that's a great question. There are several really great websites, resources. It depends. They depend a little bit on the focus. So like there are great resources for parents. There are great resources for schools, colleges, universities. I would actually be super happy to put a little list of those together. And Sam, if you have any ability to sort of field that somewhere, I can make.
Yes, I can absolutely send that out.
All right, great.
I will absolutely send out a list of resources during the follow-up email. So look out for that. Is there any other questions? I'll let a couple seconds go by and let them filter in. I actually have a question of my own that I would like to ask. I want you to challenge us. If we had to do one thing today after this session, what would it be?
Look at your donation and sign up forms and see, do they have salutation on them? And if they do, is it required? And and whether or not they're required, do you have the gender neutral MX salutation on them? And then consider, first of all, if it's required, just make it unrequired. If it doesn't have MX, add MX, and then also consider, does this need to be there at all?
Thank you. I think you're giving everybody here a pretty good framework for diversity and inclusion, so we appreciate that. The next question from Laura, thank you so much for this session. Do you recommend that we ask for salutation as well as pronoun?
That depends a little bit. So it depends on the context and it depends on what kind of form you're asking on. So for example, in the progressive political movement sphere where I live, it is generally the practice not to ask for salutations at all on any kind of forms. Donation forms, ticket forms, sign up forms, we're just not asking for salutation. If it is, back when I worked more in the performing arts realm with symphonies and operas, a lot of organizations did prefer to keep the field on their forms, but make sure, we always encourage people, of course, to make sure that it was not required. If you have a sense, everybody kind of has a general sense of their donor base, right? If you get the sense that some amount of your donor base would really like to be addressed by a salutation, then you can go ahead and have it there and just make sure that it is not required. But it's also the kind of thing that is the sort of information that you might get from additional interaction with a donor. So rather than having people do that right up front, just when, on your donation form on your website, following up with, again, like I'm a big advocate of, if you want to collect additional information from people, shooting an email out periodically saying, would you like to add to or update your contact information? It's also really great, and this of course depends on what kind of platform someone uses, but if you use any kind of a platform that has like a portal somewhere that people can log in or click a link in their email to go to a page that has additional options, if there's any additional but not super required information that you want people to fill in, that's a great place to put it. So that when people update their info, they can update whatever info that you would like them to update. I'll put a caveat on that though, that the demographic type information like gender, race, ethnicity, income, age, things like that are best left completely anonymous. So even if you want that information and you're like, I know not to put that on a form, but I would like to learn that, like a portal page is still not where you'd want to do that. That would just be an anonymous survey.
Thank you. And I think that is all the questions today. That was fantastic. I have learned a lot. I'm sure that everybody else has learned a lot as well. There will be a 3-question survey at the end of this presentation that I encourage you to answer. It's anonymous. We would love it if you could share your thoughts about the session. Your feedback helps us shape our future conferences to be better and more catered to your needs. I'm sure Jude would also appreciate hearing what you thought. Otherwise, we will see you in about 20 minutes for our next session. I'm going to pop that screen up on now so you can get a look at what's coming up next. We've got Clay Buck, and he will be presenting on donors, data, and doing what's right, an ethical and Lego-centered look at prospect development. As someone with the last name Lego, I'm very intrigued already. I will also be moderating that session. You're not done with me yet. Other than that, though, I will hand it back to Jude for a final goodbye.
Thank you so much, everybody. This has been really, really, really wonderful. Again, my email, I just took down the slide, but hopefully you got a chance to see my email. It's just jude.scheimer@gmail.com. And I'm very open to continuing this conversation if you have any questions. And thanks so much to Sam and Tequila generally for having me back.
All right, well, have a great day, everybody, and see you later.
Bye, y'all.